So I'm delighted to be here. Thank you to JD and Alana and everyone at the Academies for inviting me to speak this evening. I'm delighted. I've been to many of these programs and I've really learned a lot here. And in fact, if you think about informal learning, we're doing it right now, right? We've already done some of it in hearing about some of the projects that people have shared. And I hope that those will foster some conversations during the reception, as will those, the talks of my colleagues up here, which I also very much look forward to. Before I talk to you a bit about informal science learning, I need to tell you a story about myself a little bit, and because I think it's really emblematic of how the opportunities that people have to get into science and STEM and STEAM through various entry points and pathways. So when I went to middle school, elementary school, junior high and high school, I took all the normal courses. I went to an average working class high school in the Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania region, and I was interested in music, mostly. I was in school at a time when rock music was sort of at its peak, if you could say, when the Beatles came out, and those were people that I identified with. That's what I was interested in. It looked like the people who were having the most fun to me. My science teachers did not engage me for whatever reason. I'm not saying it was completely their fault, but I was not engaged by my schooling in science. What I'm going to talk about tonight has very much to do with interest and identity and how that's sort of a theme in informal learning and how my own experience of it played out. Fast forward, I ended up going to conservatory and studied classical music as an undergrad. I got a degree in classical guitar. A composer friend of mine who I went to school with had moved to California, and I moved shortly after to the San Francisco Bay Area. And she was on a program at a place called the Exploratorium called Speaking of Music. And so Speaking of Music is what got me in the door of a science museum in the first place, because it was a program about music. And Keith Jarrett was one of the people there. It was an interview format, a little bit like playing some music, talking about your influences, your process, the idea that creative processes in music and science were inquiry processes were different, but also connected and aligned. And the founder of the Exploratorium, Frank Oppenheimer, was an amateur flutist himself, so he very much appreciated and wanted to show that value in the programming that he did. I have a quote up here from Ben Lilly, who some of you may know started the Story Collider project, now runs a club in New York called Caveat. My project was interviewing some science communication trainers a few years ago, and I was talking to Ben about what was important about getting people who aren't necessarily into science, and he said that science has to not be the only thing in the room, right? So these events like Nerd Nights and other things where you've got talks, but some of them might be science, but they might be on other topics, and they're often very effective in bringing communities together and people of different interests together. So the Exploratorium, when I went there, by the way, this is the year, the 50th anniversary of the Exploratorium. In fact, this month is the 50th anniversary of the Exploratorium. It opened in October of 1969, when I was still playing guitar in a band. And I would have never thought in a million years that I'd be working there one day. But true to its informal name, the Exploratorium is a museum of science, art, and human perception, so named, and also opened in October. But that previous summer, in August, we're preparing for the opening and had the front doors open at the Palace of Fine Arts one day, and people started wandering in. The door was unlocked, so people wandered in. So Frank Oppenheimer turned to a staff member and said, "I guess we're open." And so the sort of this resurgence in the field of interactive science museums that started with museums in the 60s, like the Exploratorium, and by the way, it wasn't the only one. The Pacific Science Center opened in 1962. The Lawrence Hall of Science opened in 68. The Ontario Science Center opened the same year as the Exploratorium. And there had been science museums in the country for many years. In the 30s, the MSI in Chicago opened and the Franklin Institute in Philadelphia. But this idea of came on the scene strong in 1969. There were exhibits there, of course, that captured my interest as a musician, physics of sound, which I had never thought about sound in the ways it was exposed to there. And in science museums, for me, it was a new thing. Everything was big, right? So it wasn't these little demos that we had in class and school, but everything was at these huge proportions that made them accessible and also very dramatic in their effects. So, you know, Pipes of Pan, this exhibit that takes all the sounds in the place, the ambient sounds in the place, and resonates. Those sounds resonate in the tubes based on the length. Was a fascinating thing for people to go along and listen to the different pitches based on the length of the pipe. The columns, those Corinthian columns that line the Palace of Fine Arts that are in the first photo, one of those was hollowed out and made into a room in which a gamelan instrument was placed, and people could play that instrument. And when those pitches resonated in that 60-foot high column, they would, of course, reflect off the top, come back down, and there would be interference of those compression waves. And depending on the level at which your ears were in the room, up or down, you stood up or you crouched down, you would either hear the pitch or you would not sometimes hear it at all, even though it was in the room. And so that completely impressed me, that a place had figured out how to put you inside a musical instrument, right? Literally like inside a musical instrument. And then there are a number of models, of course, of exhibits. Redundancy was a huge feature of the field too, especially at the Exploratorium, where a variety of exhibits showed the same phenomena in different ways. Invisible effects of the invisible is this one where the sound waves that go across the air in a tube then disturb a liquid, a clear liquid, that shows where the nodes and antinodes of pressure are in the tube, and those correspond, of course, to the pitch and the amplitude of what you hear. After that visit to the program, began volunteering at the museum, and then I found out they were hiring explainers part-time. It sounded like a great job to me. I was a musician. I was teaching lessons in after-school programs and after-school settings, but this was a seasonal job in the mornings to be an explainer, to lead field trips around, and they were looking for people who were not necessarily with a science background, which was perfectly me, right? So I started working there as an explainer, and I suddenly, around identity, was exposed to a whole bunch of people in the sciences, whether they be scientists themselves, exhibit developers, engineers, artists, who had lots of dimensionality in ways that I didn't experience when I'm with my teachers in school. So I was able to see lots of different role models of people that embrace science, that were experts in it on a continuum of all different levels. And that was an important thing for me and really converted me to this way of teaching and using exhibits, of course, that are really dramatic. A few years into that, I had the opportunity to join a high school program as a manager. Frank Oppenheimer, who is, of course, the famous physicist who started the Exploratorium, had instituted an explainer program of high school students from the Greater Bay Area, urban high school students from the Greater Bay Area. There was a student who particularly impressed him in the first year, an African-American woman named Darlene Librero, who's sort of my mentor in this field, who at one point was looking for someone to help her lead the program as a manager. And high school was always my favorite age to teach when I taught music, and I thought, wow, this is a great opportunity. They also recruited students from a variety of backgrounds, not just science, but the arts and and humanities and a variety of interests. I worked there in this capacity for a number of years, and we had exhibits like, you've all seen these kind of things, colored shadow walls, where you have, lights reflecting, projecting onto a screen, and depending on which color light of the three primary colors that you block, you see different color shadows. The way that you used to work at the Exploratorium was the exhibit designers put the exhibits out, and they watched and they listened and they decided whether or not people were getting them or not, right? People are using it correctly, they're understanding it, but it was all kind of eavesdropping. One day in about the mid-90s, a woman showed up and said, I have some funding to study. She was a PhD student at Berkeley at the time. I'd like to systematically study one of your exhibits, really study it. Watch people, interview them, ask them for explanations, ask them to mediate explanations that I give them. And this was the beginning, really, at that place, and also corresponded in the field with a whole era around evidence gathering about what actually happens for people by using all the tools of social science to find out what actually happens in informal learning. So that was a really key moment there. And now, of course, in those days, there was nobody on staff doing that. At the Exploratorium now, there's at least a dozen people who do nothing but visitor evaluation and research. So it's a huge deal. And it's led to this knowledge building in the field that allows me to be standing up here talking to you now, because funders who support evidence-based practices want to see people using what other people have learned from studies like these, right? So JD mentioned the publications, some of the publications the Academy has done. This is also the anniversary, it's a 10th anniversary though, of a publication that came out, two actually, that came out in 2009, that was called Learning Science in Informal Environments, People, Places, and Pursuits, right? And one of the famous images from this era was this one that was developed at the Life Center at the University of Washington in Seattle, where sort of a visualization of how much of people's life they actually spend in school over the course of a relatively long life, right? And it's about 18.5%, right? And all that other blue sea around it is the time when people are doing other things and have opportunities to learn and do often. And these days, of course, there's so many more potential opportunities in which to learn about science, STEM, or any topic actually. But it was a kind of way of framing the opportunity space. The American Academy of Arts and Sciences in Cambridge, Massachusetts have a couple of publications that I also recommend that came out this past year that are free to download. I brought some outside. You can just grab them. They're also free to download online. That have some images in them and a lot of data about how people encounter in science in America these days in all the different ways. And you can see probably from some of these images the types of ways in which we all know that it's possible to encounter science. Planetaria, museums and science centers, citizen science, media, online type experiences, web-based experiences, gaming, et cetera. The way that we think about it in the professional field these days as we try to get a handle on serving a community like this, and the work that I do, is that there's places where people visit science, and that would be all the kinds of cultural institutions like the Exploratorium, like zoos, aquaria, nature centers, botanical gardens. And in the US, for example, there's 400 or so members of the Association of Science Technology Centers, the place where I work. Worldwide, there's 500 members, but if you, in any given city, you probably know of a science center or a children's museum, as well as those other type of institutions. Participating in doing and making these days is a huge field that's really taken off in the last 15 or so years. Places where you can go and actually participate as a data gatherer in a citizen science program, for example. It may be connected to a university, it may be connected to a museum, it may be connected to another institution. There's also the makerspace area, which is completely taken off. There's makerspaces in all 50 states, as far as we know. The Maker Ed and the Nation of Makers try to track these things, but they can't even keep up with the number of makerspaces that are constantly multiplying in the field. Of course, there's attending things like festivals. There's 47 festivals across the US now. There's a Science Festival Alliance. There's watching television, film, YouTube is big, of course, podcasts, all those different ways. Those Academy reports that I mentioned to you were really important in identifying the strands of learning. In other words, what people learn in these settings, right? So there were 6 strands that they identified, but I'm really focusing today on the 2 that seem from the evidence to be the strongest for opportunity for informals, at least at the outset, right? At getting people interested. Sparking interest and excitement, as it did for me as a person who just came on a visit that wasn't planning. I wasn't there for the science in the first place. And then identifying with the scientific enterprise. That is to say, identifying as someone who embraces science, can understand it, can actually use it to make decisions, and feels comfortable talking about or reading about science. How people learn is more in the realm of what I'm going to explain now. Is it has to do more with how practitioners think about how informal settings work, right? The research says a lot, and I recommend those volumes and others that are out there to really look at the synthesis of what's been learned across a lot of different settings. But as I go through these few aspects of how people learn, I think you'll notice some universal learning kind of values or principles, right? So building on prior interests and knowledge, not starting from what you think you want to impart to people, but what people actually bring. An asset-based approach is sometimes called, taking into account people's culture, their background, the prior knowledge they bring. That whatever you use, whether it's exhibits, film, whatever, if it's a makerspace and you have materials, that whatever you're presenting invites some kind of inquiry. It has properties in it and of itself that can be exploited or learned from, that they're just, they're not just curriculum tools that were not thought about for how generative they could be. STEM can be a means or an end in informal STEM learning. So you're either doing STEM to maybe make an art piece, or you're actually making some art, and then in the end, there's some STEM that you've learned in the process, or you make a STEM-related kind of object in the end, some kind of instrument or something that you can use to measure, as some people do, for example, with microscopes. There's multiple pathways in and through, so again, there has to be a lot of different entry points for people with different backgrounds and different interests. You don't have to always start at the beginning, you can start at the middle. You can walk into a makerspace in a lot of museums and not have to sit down and say, what are we making today? But you can just work with whatever's on the table. Ability to make choices and change direction, extend tools, all these things that people do in a process of inquiry, right? Which is, if you look at all these principles, you would think, well, these are all principles of what would be good learning in any setting, formal or informal. Right? But when you think about it, how hard is it in a school to do this kind of thing? Right? If anybody's ever taught in a classroom, everybody, I think, who's a good teacher would love to do these things. And sometimes you can do them, but sometimes you're very constrained by a lot of other issues that you can't do. You can't do what you would like to do. So, of course, informal settings provide sort of an R&D spaces for these things to take place, and places where you can experiment with different approaches to phenomena, to the actual tools you use, to the pedagogy, etc. What's really been heartening for me, and at this point, this much longer away from my beginnings in the Exploratorium, is this expanding ecosystem of opportunity that exists in informal settings. There's, as I showed in the previous image of the icons, there's a number of places, of course, where people can experience STEM, STEAM in very direct ways, and there's a lot of hybrid things in between. JD mentioned LabX, and Jeff is here. There's lots of new, very experimental approaches to entities that are sometimes places to visit, sometimes places to have a conversation, sometimes places to play a game, sometimes places to make things, but it's responsive to what's out there in the field, which is many, many opportunities. I think where the two big, really important opportunities right now that are in our field that are being pursued, one is to try to track what the long-term impact on a person's life is of these kind of things, especially a student who might be starting out young and having exposure to these kind of experiences. And how those cumulative experiences lead to either an appreciation for science, a more comfort level with science, using science again to make decisions in your life, becoming a scientist, becoming a researcher, going that route, all the different possible ways that you can have STEM enrich your life. A STEM-enriched life is really what's I think a goal of many of us, regardless of what form it takes. And that means that our definition of STEM has to be very broad, right? So in one study that was in that volume I mentioned, a number of nurses were interviewed about what they did and whether it was a STEM job. And they said, no, I don't. A couple of people said, I don't have a STEM job. Well, what could be a more STEM-related job than being a nurse, right? So there's the study of the long-term impact, but then there's the idea that sometimes what we need to do is just connect these things. Starting a new program, of course, is always welcome, and it can be very important, but there are cities where there are a lot of opportunities that aren't connected. There are some funders now who are actually funding something called STEM ecosystems, and that's ecosystem with a capital E, in different cities, and many cities have these. where there's actual regular meetings of the providers of STEM learning in those cities to compare notes, to refer each other to opportunities for people that are in their programs and in their activities. And it's basically enough money to sort of get started and seed these kind of relationships, but I think it's really a good step in the right direction of connecting, again, the wider ecosystem. I mentioned that the Academy's reports, and these are some other ones that are really wonderful. I highly recommend all of these, especially if you want to get a sense of what the field is. And if you're developing a project in any of these kind of realms, well, STEM learning is everywhere. The one on the far left is one that came out of a convocation here in about 2013, which was really a formal recognition that there are ecosystems with small e and big E, and we need to connect them better. Productive and supporting, identifying and supporting productive out-of-school STEM is really a youth-focused volume, but it's a very much almost like a how-to about the characteristics of successful, generative youth programs in STEM seem to all have a few characteristics that they share. You know, they're engaging, they take into account people's previous knowledge as well as their culture and all those aspects of their lives, and they also are connective. They connect those opportunities to other ones. There's also disciplinary related ones like in chemistry, and different approaches like learning science through computer games and learning through citizen science, which is a citizen science we could have a whole night on, and I think we have had nights here on citizen science in the past. So I'll just want to mention a couple of resources that the project that I run, CASE, provides. We have a website called informalscience.org, and I know we're going to hear some great examples tonight of projects that would be like the kind of things that are here. I'm always jealous of all these projects like the one we're going to hear about because I don't run one of them. I just get to pay attention to all of them and try to disseminate the knowledge that people are learning and the good work that's going on through our website. We have a blog, we have a monthly newsletter. It's all free because it's funded by the National Science Foundation, and there are over 8,000 examples on this website of project descriptions, research papers, as well as evaluation reports. Getting back to the identity thing for a moment, we have found over time that identity is a huge factor now that's being studied in people's learning of STEM, right? Whether it's identity as a goal of a program, you're trying to develop someone's STEM identity by the activities you design, or you need to take into account and mediate their identity as you design. This is particularly true for adult programs. The people in science communication who are in this room will know that identity is huge in terms of taking in information about political issues or controversial science issues like climate change. Facts aren't enough. People take in information through the lens of who they identify with and how they identify themselves. And this is a very important topic. So we've done interviews with a number of people on the website who actually study identity, interest, and engagement, and are able to share a little bit in these little clips. And then we have full transcripts of the interviews too that help you if you're designing something with identity in mind. We also make peer-reviewed research available to people who do not work in academia. Many people who design in after-school programs or in museums and so on are no longer connected to universities. So if they want to use research to inform their proposal or the development of their project, they don't have access. Through EBSCO, we provide that access on informalscience.org. That's my disclaimer from the NSF. And I'd just like to end with kind of a reflection on my own experience. So, and this is of course another exhibit that's at the new Exploratorium, which by the way moved from the Palace of Fine Arts, which you probably know, to Pier 15 in San Francisco to another beautiful location. I'll show you that in a moment. But this is a reflection of myself in a mirror that is a giant mirror that is an exhibit on the floor that was built by NASA. It was actually for a flight simulator. And it had a small perfection in the mirror such that it could not be used for its original purpose. It was donated to the Exploratorium. They just put it out on the floor, basically with a little corral around it, and it's just a mirror, but it is an absolutely amazing, wonderful, beautiful mirror. If you've ever experienced a mirror of that quality, and most people don't have that access, what you can do with it in terms of walking towards it, walking through the focal point, seeing your face flip, juxtapose yourself with other people. All these things that this convex mirror can do of such high quality is kind of just one of these wonderful things that was not designed for, it wasn't originally thought about, but it's a material, it's an object that really provides a lot of opportunities for inquiry. In my, so the Exploratorium is now on Pier 15, and this is just kind of really honestly a coincidence, but I do follow what goes on at the Exploratorium, even though I left there in 2006. And in their 50th year, this year, the exhibit that they had featured is on identity, of all things, right? And that makes perfect sense to me at this point in time in our field where, with regard to learning, yes, we can get better at explaining physics and chemistry and biology, and we can always get better at communicating it and making it more awe-inspiring and wonderful. But there's something else I think that everybody is realizing who try to get people to learn and appreciate these topics, is that the visitors, the audience, the participants bring their lives, every part of their lives, their emotional life, their cultural life, their intellectual life to these situations. And that means that that's their identity with regard to that topic when they first confront you, or you first have the opportunity to engage them. And so it makes perfect sense to me that the Exploratorium at this point in time would have an exhibit on identity that has a number of exhibits that ask you to think about how you think about yourself in relationship to a number of topics, some STEM topics in relation to other people, in relationship to nature, and I think this is a great opportunity in our field now to really explore the things that the learners bring. Thank you.
Thank you.